Awesome. All right, well, welcome to Devs Discuss, a weekly discussion of issues in the game development industry. I am your host, I suppose, for the night. We're here at IUPUI, and today we're going to be discussing gender and identity and orientation in games. As part one of a two-part series, next week we'll be discussing race and class. Obviously, this is kind of a big issue right now, in part because of the discussion going on about the lack of diversity in the industry as a whole, but also within the games we play. So we're going to be focusing more on the game side of things tonight rather than the industry side of things. If you are interested in hearing more about the industry side of things, you can check out one of our previous videos. It's up on YouTube. We're going to kick things off with an extra credits video. If the internet here cooperates, it's running kind of slow tonight. There we go. So we're gonna kick things off. Let me see if I can get the screen shared here real quick. There we go. Yeah, show that. Look at that. Oh yeah. Everyone. I think that's working.
I think one of the most limiting things in modern game design is our radically oversimplified view of gender. And I'm not just talking about portrayals of female characters or objectification or gender stereotypes or any of that. We still have an abundance of problems in those areas, of course, no question. Our failings in those areas limit us, and there's a lot of change and growth that we need to go through. But today I want to talk about a specific aspect of gender stereotyping which we almost never discuss in these conversations: mechanics stereotyping. We regularly hear designers talk about mechanics as if certain mechanics were only viable for specific genders. I hear things like, first-person shooters are for boys, and match 3 games are for girls, with shocking regularity. In fact, it's become so ubiquitous that it's passed into the realm of unspoken rule. It's just become a tacit collective assumption amongst our industry. But this commonly held belief isn't just limiting, it's flat out wrong. Why? Because we see counterexamples to it all the time. Industry wisdom says that action RPGs are boy games, and yet Kingdom Hearts has an enormous female following. They say first-person shooters only appeal to men, but as soon as you get one that's not about violent conflict like Portal, suddenly you see massive appeal across gender lines. And if Match 3 mechanics are just for women, why did Puzzle Quest have a largely male audience? I could go on for a long time listing off all the exceptions to these silly rules, but you get the point. So where do these stereotypes come from? Well, they come from the theming these mechanics are traditionally associated with, and from the initial cultures that grew up around these mechanics when they were first created. As much as I hate to say it, I do think there is such a thing as gender-biased theming. It's unfortunate, but from the day we're born, we're bombarded with a lot of societal ideas about what our gender should and shouldn't like. And many industries spend billions of dollars to steer our collective perception of gender identities in certain ways. The specifics vary between cultures, and it may not always be intentional or malicious, but everything from the design of Barbie toys to the presentation and recruitment messaging of our military influences how the average American believes gender should affect our identity. And that's not to say that we never break from those stereotypes, or even that you can't be comfortable living within those stereotypes and still enjoy things outside of them as well. I'm just saying that in aggregate, when you take a sample of hundreds of millions of people, cultural ideas of gender do influence how you sell products to a gender. It's kind of a self-reinforcing circle. So yes, in aggregate, games about war, ultraviolence, and being a hero based on one's strength and martial dominance will generally sell better to men than women. And since first-person shooters began in that mold and generally stick to the formula even today, we've conflated first-person shooter mechanics with the theming that they're usually tied to, and thus have decided as an industry that first-person shooters aren't for women. But that conflation keeps us from experimenting. It locks us into these old and tired ideas of what a genre can or should be. Let me give you an example. Recently, James was asked to work on a hidden object game. Now, hidden object is a type of gameplay that the industry has pigeonholed as female. When James brings them up to industry folk, the response is almost always something like, "Those are just girl games." But that stereotype exists because the genre was first invented in the casual market, when that side of the industry was specifically looking to connect with a female audience. As such, most of these games have theming which is heavily targeted at women. In fact, if you go back to our episode about hidden object games, we talked about how most of their protagonists are female, and how the writers of those games don't seem to have trouble writing female characters in quite the same way that AAA developers sometimes do. But these don't have to be girl games. Again, it's just a matter of theme. James was going to pitch this idea to the client, but it's just too perfect an example for the point I'm trying to make, so I'm going to use it here. Imagine a hidden object game set in a post-apocalyptic zombie world. You're a scavenger. You live in a small community, and every day you have to go out and search for the things your community needs to survive. You have to acquire the food, water, and clothes that your small band needs. You have to outfit them with weapons and ammo to get through the night. You have to find the tools and supplies you require to upgrade your base. Each evening, you talk to your people, manage what's being built at your hideout, and you have to choose who you let into your camp, and who you leave for the zombies outside. During the day, you scavenge, and it plays just like a hidden object game. But there's a timer ticking down while you search, signaling the approach of the zombie hordes. How much time you're given is dependent on your gear, your party, and how well you know the area. You've got access to one-time use items you've found or crafted to increase the time limit, but every second you stay past the end of the timer, every second you spend finding that food you desperately need to keep everybody alive, increases the likelihood that the zombies burst in, possibly wounding you or killing your crew. There's even more to do with base building and fending off attacks and talking to the people you've assembled around you and such, but you get the basic idea. It's not the mechanics that have a gender bias, it's the theming. Although I'd like to think that the zombie apocalypse is a bias-free playground for us all. James has dozens of these design pitches for all kinds of genres. This mentality that a set of mechanics exclusively appeals to the group that was the target audience for the few games that established their use is only holding us back. Developers, think of the innovation opportunities. Gaming fans, think of the fascinating new varieties of awesome games we might see. Industry people, think of the broader audiences you could be reaching. Everyone wins. Seriously, it's time we stop thinking of mechanics in terms of gender. See you next week.
So that's just kind of one of the extra credit videos out there that starts to cover kind of our ideas of, oh, we have another guest. Welcome. Can't see video anymore. Oh, what's happened there? What have I done? Well, you can watch it afterwards, I'm sure. But that is one of just many games that kind of cover gender as an issue within the industry. And I kind of want to start this talk off with just a brief discussion of some recent issues or, I suppose, topics in the industry as far as gender is concerned, and a few recent titles that have had some interesting dialogue on this issue. Real quick, I want to check with the people watching. Can you all see us now? Potentially. Yes? Was that a thumbs up? Awesome. Okay.
Yay.
You can see us. You just couldn't see the video. Okay, that works. I'm also going to move around the screen and see if we can get a few more chairs visually available so that we're not all crammed together. But there were a couple different discussions at GDC that covered gender and orientation in games, as well as just some of the struggles developmentally in how you can be more inclusive in games. And one of the big talks that they had was on the recent game Sunset Overdrive and their system of letting you choose several different body types from both genders. And one of the things they struggled with developmentally was creating rigs for that many characters and assets and clothing for all of those characters. So, I mean, kind of what Extra Credits was talking about is there is issues with mechanics as far as what we think of as being male mechanics or female mechanics, but then also developmentally the hardware challenges of having assets for both male characters and female characters, and then within that, how you express those genders in your character if you were to go that far into it. So that's just one of the challenges. Now, just because there's challenges does not mean that we should just give up, obviously, or we never move forward. But there are things to think about in how you can work around that sort of thing. Other interesting games that kind of tackle this issue. In the most recent Animal Crossing game, once you get so far within the game, you can actually unlock the opposite gender's hairstyles from the salon. However, those are not a default thing that's available to the player. They have to actually work for it, which is a little bit of a step in the opposite direction. However, that's more of a cultural issue. The Animal Crossing games being largely developed in Japan for a Japanese audience with a strong American following as well. They are less open to, give your male character a dress. Well, you can, but one of the characters in the game will actually be like, well, this is actually for our women's collection, but I guess you can wear it. Whereas you don't really see that if you're a female character wanting to wear clothing from the male lines. I don't know. I got like a samurai outfit for my female character, and when I bought it, the shopkeeper was like, "Oh, this is from the male collection, but it's gonna look great on you." So I feel like there's still some inequality in even what's acceptable, depending on if you're a female character wanting to wear a male outfit as opposed to a male character wanting to wear a traditionally female outfit. And that's as simple as changing the language that the shopkeeper says when you make that choice, or choosing not to say that there is a male or a female collection. It's just clothing. It fits on a body. But I kind of wanted to get your guys' thoughts if there's been any games you've played recently that either tackled an issue of gender well or poorly in a way that could be easily fixed.
I feel like Assassin's Creed Unity had everyone knows about the hubbub they had with female characters being hard to animate, and I feel like there is some they said it poorly, and I feel like there is some sort of credence to that. Like if you already have a character, it is more work objectively to make another brand new rig for it, but I feel like that was a poor approach to the problem.
There was an interesting talk at GDC that was titled
Nicholas.
"Do not do that, or I will kick you out."
Oh.
Why would you do that?
Because they muted us, and we're trying to have a discussion. But I think, yeah, that is one side of the thing. Is there are some differences in a rig, and if you've already got one rig, you don't necessarily want to modify it, although they're making a lot of advances in scalability of rigs. With recent technology, that's becoming less and less of an issue. There's still some differences, but there's workarounds. One of the interesting ones that was brought up by the talk about Sunset Overdrive is they were able to use the same rig for 5 out of the 6 different character types by scaling, which is so like all of the female rigs had no problem, and the 2 smaller male rigs not a problem. But their largest male rig, they had wider shoulders, and they were having trouble with the arms. But they were actually able to work around that by adding a second set of arms. The rig had 4 arms. Well, 4 arms, but still 2 hands. It would essentially, they had the main arm, but then they had a larger, wider set arm attached, but still connected at the shoulder and wrist. So it controlled the arms properly, but they didn't have to worry about the hands not reaching the same spots when it would like climb up a ladder or anything like that.
That's ingenious. That's amazing.
Which added very little to the existing rig.
Another example, kind of going with the whole gender diversity thing, is the Mass Effect games.
True. There was actually a very interesting article that came out recently. One of their lead animators came forward to say that originally the female version of Captain Shepard was meant to be the original, the default character, but for marketing reasons, most likely, that was not the case when it released.
And I know the whole relationship things in the game, you can, if you are a female Shepard, you can still, to my knowledge, I've not played these Mass Effect games like a lot. I've played a bit of the second one, but you can still get with some of the female crewmates. And as the male, you can still get with one of the male crewmates as a love interest.
Yeah.
And they tackled it really well, I feel, because like they didn't make any commotion about it in the game or stuff like that. It's just like, oh, okay. And then, you know, the media gets a hold of that and says there was that whole debacle with Fox about the Mass Effect games and that.
Yeah. I believe also in Skyrim you can have same-gendered partnerships. It's been a while since I played it, though. One of the games that handles gender interestingly, not necessarily good or bad, there's a really interesting indie game called Loved, where you start the game and they'll ask what your gender is, and then immediately will tell you that you're the opposite. So if you say you're a woman, they'll say, no, you're a boy. And the whole game will continue to call you that gender as you play, which is an interesting look at gender dysphoria a little bit, I would say, whether intentional or not. There's a lot of discussion about the intention behind that choice in the game. But it's interesting to see how something as simple as ignoring your preferred gender in a game can make you feel, which is, I think, one way that games can kind of help educate people who don't normally deal with those issues as to how other people feel. I'm trying to think. There's a few other games that do that, or games that don't have a choice. But also, one of the things that's interesting is the argument that some people will try to make is that if you make games with female character, you won't have as many male players, which is typically actually not true. There are plenty of male players who choose to play as a female character in an RPG game for many different reasons. Whether it be that they just want to have a character that looks nice to them if they're going to be playing that character for a large amount of time, or they like the abilities that character has, or many other reasons. But but you often don't hear the argument that female players won't play a game that only has male characters, simply because I don't know, people assume there's not that many female players anyways. They're going to play whatever they're going to play, regardless of any truth behind that. It's interesting to think that we're concerned as developers, not all of us, but there's a trend that we're more concerned about how do we get male players over female players, which is interesting. One of the talks that I had at GDC was with a lady of the name Sherry Granter-Ray, who's been in the industry for years and years and years before there was an industry. And some of the best advice she had for me was when dealing with issues of this nature, it's important to look at the money side of things rather than what is morally or socially right. When making an argument to someone who, whether they be a publisher or your marketing people or whatever, of what is your target audience? If your target audience is male, you're excluding a large amount of money coming from potential female players, which is interesting in that we think, oh, we've got this target audience that's established, we want to go for their money, when probably those people that we think of as our core target gamers, our core audience, they're going to play a game if they like it, regardless of if it necessarily panders to stereotypes of what those players like. But you're probably not going to bring in players outside of that audience unless you're specifically marketing to them. Because otherwise a game can feel very exclusive as far as this game isn't for you, you shouldn't be playing it, so they're not going to. So it's interesting that sometimes we market to people who don't necessarily need to be marketed to. They're gamers, and they're going to play games regardless of if you're pouring money into getting them to play your game, because they're going to play it anyways, because that's what they do. Which isn't the hard set rule behind this sort of thing either way. But it's something to keep in mind when you're working on a game, is thinking beyond your target audience, I suppose. Any thoughts so far? I feel like I'm talking a lot.
Yeah, I just gotta say, if you've ever tried to play multiplayer in Advanced Warfare, literally the only difference between the male and female characters is the head and the voice. So it's not always hard.
Yeah. I think sometimes we build the issue of making a game inclusive to people of all genders is more difficult than it actually needs to be sometimes. One of the interesting things about text-based games is that often the player gets to define themselves, and then therefore it's open to the player, regardless of any specific things that are built into the game. And I think there's a challenge of being able to take that element of defining yourself from a text-based world into a visual game, which is certainly a challenge, just due to the inherent nature of a visual game as opposed to a text-based game.
Silent protagonists.
Hmm?
Silent protagonists.
Silent protagonists. Yeah, we'll just tackle it with silent protagonists and first-person cameras.
I mean, Halo 3 ODST is pretty ambiguous.
Mm-hmm.
Your character never speaks. Always wear a mask.
And they don't even like acknowledge them by gender. They just call them rookie.
But in other Halo games, they of course acknowledge your character's gender. In Halo Reach, you could choose. Um,
Yeah.
Kind of going back onto like the whole mechanics thing.
Mhm.
I feel like what they said is true. I do feel that's how kind of the industry is right now. Is like, oh, FPS games are for males, and those puzzle games technically are for females, because you like just kind of the standard that the industry has set. Like, oh, the FPSs have this in it, so none of the females will play this. Well, I have more female friends than male friends who play those type of games. So
We're actually extremely violent, whether you think we are or not.
But another one I wanted to bring up was kind of fighting games.
Yeah.
That's another really big male-populated genre, male-populated like mechanic area. Just because it's like you see some of your favorite characters like in Brawl and stuff. That's more party-oriented, but you still see those characters beating the tar out of each other, and stuff like Mortal Kombat, which gets really grotesque and really bloody. And guys, apparently, I'm trying to find a word here. It's like thought of that men and guys would enjoy that more than the women would.
Yeah. I would say there's stereotypes, and they come from multiple places. Anywhere from what toys we give our children when they're young to what we market for them as they grow. So there's certainly a cultural issue, but I wouldn't say it's the hard and fast rule. Although I will say I'm awful at shooters. Through nothing to do with my gender, I'm just clumsy and not coordinated, and shooting small things at small targets is difficult.
I think it's interesting how competitive games seem to have the biggest gender bias.
Yes, I think there's a cultural belief that men are more competitive than women. When I would say we're competitive in different ways, typically. Obviously, exceptions to every rule. I think it's been a while, but I did read a study that women are typically more competitive in team-based competition, or in where it's not an us versus them situation, but more of a like who's lasting the longest sort of situation. So women are typically more competitive when it comes to, say, a survival game rather than a shoot 'em up.
There used to be I wouldn't say a long time ago, like 7-8 years ago, there used to be this an entire female Halo team, that not just Halo specifically, but they went around playing a bunch of shooter competitions, stuff like that, called the Frag Dolls.
It's a good name.
Like you said, there's always one exception to the rule.
Well, usually more than one exception, but
They were really big.
yeah.
Won a lot of competitions.
I think it's interesting. A little bit off topic, but the game described in the extra credits video reminds me an awful lot of a zombie-less version of This War of Mine.
Yes, I was thinking that exact same thing.
Which I wouldn't say there's anything specifically gendered about the game if you've played it. There's a fairly equal number of male and female survivors that you can have in your group. Although it is interesting to note, if you played the game, each character that could be on your survival group has a trait, and they don't have a lot of combat-related traits assigned to the women, which I suppose is somewhat accurate as far as the time period that's somewhat portrayed in the game. You wouldn't have female soldiers really. Although, I mean, the game is kind of open as to what time period it is. It doesn't have anything specific about it. So you could have female soldiers, but none of the female characters have like trained in combat or things of that nature. They're usually like cheers people up or is good with children, and the male characters get things that are more like trained in combat, so I don't get sad when I accidentally kill that elderly couple, or things of that nature. So there's still a bit of a bias there, though somewhat accurate, I suppose, to the stereotype of the generation it somewhat portrays. And that's a difficulty with anything that has a historical context. You know, you can't make an Assassin's Creed game about the Revolution and then throw a bunch of female soldiers in there when there weren't that many. Probably a few, but not a lot. But it's interesting to see how there's work that can be done.
Like realism versus equality.
Realism versus equality. That is a real struggle.
It's kind of a self-perpetuating thing too, because you have games like Call of Duty, which I mean, more recent ones.
Yeah.
But like, I mean, the original series, I mean, it's all males. Basically every person in the game. I'm trying to remember a female character in a Call of Duty game, and I haven't played them recently, but I can't. But I'd say, yeah, like, but that's realistic. Like for even now, it's becoming less so, but it's still realistic for lots of war zones and stuff. And it's like, in order to help that in games, and you're gonna have to help that in real life, but in order to help that in real life, you're gonna need to help in cultural perception, which comes from the games we play, and it's
it's a difficult thing, certainly. One of the games that comes to mind when I was thinking about doing this talk was, whether you like the game or not, Remember Me had a very interesting article come out a while back about the game was almost not shipped because their publisher had concerns about having a female protagonist. Because they originally planned on having a romantic subplot to the game, and they felt that male players would feel uncomfortable playing a game with a romantic subplot and a female character. Yet you see that's not really the case in other games that have that situation. For example, nobody really has trouble playing as Jodie in Beyond Two Souls, and that game has several different romantic plots you could or could not follow if you chose to, and players didn't have any issue with that. But with Remember Me, the publisher wanted them to change it to a male protagonist because they thought players would relate to it better. And I think that's where we also have an issue, is where we push people's comfort zones, and also what do actually players care about as far as relating to a game. Do they care if they play as a female character with a love interest, or do they care if they play as a male character with a love interest? Does that bother them at all? And I don't think we've really done a lot of research into what players think as far as those situations go. And And that leads to a whole untapped area of content and topics and subject matter that our games could cover, but don't for whatever reasons. So it's a very convoluted issue as far as mechanics go, as far as story goes, and things of that nature. So it's a broad issue. And I don't have a magic answer that's going to say, oh, hey, we're going to make our games all super inclusive and diverse, and you know, and nor do do our games all have to be incredibly diverse and inclusive. There's games for every player, but we should always strive to be inclusive, regardless of if our players are the character in the game. So who's to say male players can't play games with female protagonists, or vice versa? You know, who's to say players, like street players, don't want to play a queer character? We haven't challenged them that much as far as seeing what our players will and won't play. So it's an interesting issue. Other thoughts?
I definitely feel like that's starting to become more of a prevalent thing. Like the whole people becoming okay or not okay with playing a certain gender or following a certain thing within a game. And I feel like it's really opening up a lot of people, especially with story-based games nowadays, like Beyond Two Souls. That was an amazing game. I didn't play it personally. I've seen several people play it. The story's amazing, and people I've talked to who have played it said, like, oh, yeah, it's amazing. Like, they love to see the struggle that she goes through, the main character, and they even went through some of the relationship paths and just like, oh, wow, so that happened. Even another great example is Telltale Games with Walking Dead. Season 2 came out a couple years ago, and that game you play as Clementine from the first game, who is a 13 or 14-year-old little girl in the zombie apocalypse. And you have to see what her struggle was like being a girl growing up through it. And a lot of people are like, yeah, this is amazing seeing the struggle she has to go through. Of course, a lot of people might be in it just for the Walking Dead name, franchise, and stuff like that. But the story is really what holds stuff like that together. And I feel like if more games do try to take an approach kind of like that, it really is set in story-based games right now, so I don't know how it would spread to other games other than like just making the main character a female and seeing stuff they go through. But then again, it's that whole, like, some people might not play it because it's that, in that genre, stuff like that.
Yeah, potentially. I can certainly see that's an issue. And I think not necessarily related even to games, but there has been, unfortunately, a large backlash culturally, whether it be television or movies or games or whatever. That there is a section of the population that when they see any game or movie that pushes what we would consider a diverse topic, even if it's the smallest part of that media, there is a section of the population that says, all of our stuff doesn't need to be diverse. I want my normal, like, cis white normal things. And I'm like, okay, but just because, you know, that's what you see every day doesn't mean that these other things don't exist and are part of the world that you live in, whether you want to cover your ears and eyes and shout la 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 la. You can still have a character in your game who is one of these things that you would consider to be a minority or diverse. And so I think whether or not they're the protagonist in your game or they're a tiny little character, you're always going to have some people who are like, no, you're just trying to push an agenda with this. And you don't necessarily have to be pushing an agenda just because you decide to have a character that isn't a white male. It's just part of the world we're in. And I think that some people are afraid to normalize some of these things, which is unfortunately a shame that there are some people that are just backwards. So, and I don't really have an answer for that, because there is bigotry in our world and phobias and hatred, unfortunately. So you'll always have someone who's like, oh, you want to make your protagonist, you know, an African-American female. Well, no, I'm not going to play that game. And, I mean, that's their choice, but, you know, those games should exist just as much as the games that, you know, have a white male protagonist. And you'll get people who play the game regardless, so, you know.
I definitely do feel that it is a generation gap, though, mainly for stuff like that.
I think, yeah, we are seeing there is a bit of a transition between older generations that are set in certain mindsets and then younger generations, such as our own and even younger, that are a little more accepting because they're growing up around this sort of thing and they're seeing, you know, friends who fit into these categories that they don't necessarily personally identify with, and, you know, they're more open to, oh, I'll play this game, or, yeah, I'll watch this show. And I mean, we'll get past it. I remember the uproar when a Disney Channel show had 2 lesbians, and everyone was like, whoa, you're going to screw our children up. And I'm like, no, nothing happened. It was fine. And then the episode ended, and they went on with their lives, and it was cool. So we're gonna move past the initial shock of some of these things in games, and then they'll continue to be games, and people will play them. So I think that's also part of just the growing pain that as a society we're seeing is just kind of moving past some of the old mindset and into where we're moving. So be ahead of the curve is what I'm saying. It'll get there. It'll catch up. Other games.
It's kind of hard because not a lot of games really try to tackle
there's
topics like
not
this.
a lot. I did watch an extra credits video on the subject that mentioned a character in Persona 4.
Yes.
I've never played
Yes.
Persona 4
Oh,
though.
okay.
So I would let someone else tackle that topic.
What it is there is, like, in Persona 4, there's your world, and then there's this the shadow world, the TV world, which your group travels into a TV, and they have to fight the shadows within that world. Well, what happens is during a stormy night, around midnight, this thing called the Midnight Channel comes up, and the main character watches it, and they can see one person on there, a person who's going to become part of the group, or a person who's been dragged into the shadow world by someone. It's a whole murder mystery thing. And they have to go in and save them. Well, when there's this one character called Naoto Shirogane, it is presented that Naoto is a boy. They wear a boy school uniform, and he looks very not very masculine, but he has that like baby boy face. Well, he shows up in the Midnight Channel. They go in, and when you're rescuing someone from there, you have to fight their shadow of that person. Their darkest fears, their deepest secrets, what they feel should be locked away gets free and becomes like personified, hence persona. So you have to defeat that thing, and they have to accept what their shadow is in order to be set free. So what it is you go into the shadow world to rescue Naoto, and he is locked to a slab, and his shadow is acting really weird. There's actually 2 characters like this in the game. He's like, oh, don't worry. In a minute, you'll be what you always wanted to be. You'll be and it comes to a big reveal. It's like, oh yeah, you're gonna be a boy, and everyone's like, what? You're not a boy? And it's that whole long conversation of, no, and now it's actually a girl. Well, you save her, and through some time through the game, it comes to a part, if you build a relationship with her, does it say him muted?
Taylor, why did you mute us? That's okay. We still love you.
But it.
Oh.
What?
Something was playing in another window and he accidentally muted us. That's fine. But you were saying.
There comes to a decision to where Naruto comes to the main character and says, should I start acting more like a girl? And it's up to the player's decisions whether they can say no or yes. If you say no, then just like she stays the same outfit, same everything. If you say yes, though, she switches to a more feminine look. She wears a skirt. She has a no-sleeved button-up shirt on, a vest, stuff like that. And she talks in a higher-pitched voice as well. So that is a really interesting character growth to see within a game like that has come from Japan, which is known to be either really accepting to topics like this or to be really harsh on topics like this. Mm-hmm. The other character who has the same sort of thing actually stems off of the Naoto thing. You rescue him earlier in the game, but the whole thing with him is he thinks he is gay because he likes Naoto. Because it's the whole part of where he's a guy, he's cute. Like, what is this? He is a character who comes off as a very masculine guy. He's a gangster. He looks gangster. Yeah. He's a tough guy.
He's like a big biker dude.
Yeah, he just goes around and picks fights with people outside of school. He cuts classes, stuff like that. Well, at home, at his house, he likes cute things. And that makes him wonder, am I not manly? Is this something that is going to change me? And when you confront his shadow is a very flamboyant, like, just thing that's of him. And is like, oh, yes, this is you, this is really you. And he's like, okay, you fight him and he accepts it. And you can build a relationship to see more inside of him, being like, okay, so he does just like the cute things. And there's this really one part in like the later parts of his relation line where it's like something comes up to where you don't know how to take it. It's like you could say that he is gay because of something like this happening, or you could say he is not. It's all up to the character to decide decisions like that. It's not a choice, but it's something that happens. You're like, I can take this either way.
Yeah.
And it's a really great game. If you've not played it, you can probably get it on Amazon pretty cheap. It's amazing.
And that's an interesting way of bringing up topics like that. And it's interesting because when I'm listening to you hear it, I'm like, well, it's not the most tactful way to do this. So it's not the most politically correct way. But I think it's interesting to tackle it in that way because the average person, not that there really is an average, doesn't always know how to handle these sorts of issues in the correct way. They just handle them in the best way they know how, which I think is also something that we need to be more aware of when we deal with difficult issues. Is there's a correct way, and it's great if you know what the correct way is and to handle it that way, but just because you don't know everything about a topic doesn't mean you shouldn't handle that topic, whether it be in your game or in your life or whatever. Not to get too philosophical, but there's delicacy in an issue, but then there's not being afraid to handle a difficult issue, even if it's not in the best way to do it. And so that's an interesting thing that I think kind of is brought up by that, in that there's always going to be difficulty when you talk about a character's gender, because you'll have people who say, well, you only have to talk about them in the politically correct, accepted way, where you always discuss them as their preferred gender. But that can be confusing for some people, and it's not disrespectful. It's not intentionally disrespectful to refer to a character as their gender at birth, to be more clear to players. But you'll always have people on either side of the argument in that issue, at least in this day and age. I think that you're always going to have that issue of how do you refer to a character whose gender does not fit on our binary or does not fit in what's conceived to be the norm, is to how do you talk about it in a way that's understood but also respectful. And that's an issue that's not going to go away overnight. It may eventually go away with time and education, but we're not there. We're not at a point where our schools are teaching people how to deal with the issues of gender. And until that starts happening, you won't get a whole society that knows the right way to refer to someone whose gender doesn't fit their sex at birth. So that's an issue. It's a small part of it. And part of that is just time, and part of it is educating yourself. So there's multiple sides to this whole issue. But you shouldn't be afraid to tackle it, even if you're not sure of the best way to do so. Earlier this year, right around the Christmas break, there was a young transgender woman who took her life. Her name was Leela Alcorn. And in response to that, Leela was a member of the game development subreddit, as well as the Unity subreddit on reddit.com. And she had a big passion for game development. And so in response to her death, they created a game jam in her honor, with the focus of creating games that help educate people about transgender issues and help people understand transgender issues. And one of my concerns, I wanted to be a part of this jam, but I really wasn't sure how best to represent those issues, because I haven't personally experienced them. I haven't been close to someone who has, so I don't know how to properly represent that issue. So I I started talking to other people in my community who have, just so I could get a better idea of how to represent those issues. So, I mean, you don't have to know everything about a topic to begin discussing it through the power of games. And then there's also ways to use games to educate yourself about issues that you don't always know the right thing to do in. So, I would just say that, I mean, games are a tool to help people experience stories and experience things they wouldn't otherwise. You shouldn't shy away from exploring them through games, because that's one of the great powers they have that other mediums don't have. So, yeah. Other games. I kind of want to think like Pokemon. Pokemon's probably an interesting topic to go into as far as gender in games. Because often the default character in Pokemon is the male. And usually your rival is also male, and then you have like a female companion if you start with a male character. And if you start with a female character, you usually get a lot of dialogue that's like, "Oh, aren't you cute for wanting to be a Pokemon trainer?" Like, good for you, little girl. You take that Snorlax and go. And it's usually seen as like the female character is more for like doing the beauty contests with your Pokemon and stuff. And those are just things that are implied through very small bits of dialogue throughout the game, but they do have an effect on how the character is perceived. That is also a cultural issue, I suppose. Again, being a largely Japanese development team, and then translating over. But one of the other really cool characters, two characters I want to bring up now that I'm remembering all of my notes. I never bring my notes with me. I'm a bad person. Two interesting characters from the Mario series. First being Birdo. You can't talk about gender and orientation in games without talking about Birdo. In the American version of Mario, Birdo is a female. In the Japanese version, Birdo is a male, quote-unquote, character who believes themselves to be female, or who would be considered transgender in our modern understanding of the issue. The character was introduced long before the term transgender became acceptable, I suppose, in society. And Birdo is still in several of the Mario games, although I don't believe she's in the roster for Smash anymore. She used to be, though, right? No, but she was in Mario Kart, but not anymore. Yeah, you can't play Birdo in Mario Kart anymore. So,
I think I know who other characters in this one.
Vivian from Paper Mario.
I have another one.
Paper Mario 2. We'll certainly discuss that one too then. But Vivian is, again, portrayed as a female character in the American version, but is a transgender character in the Japanese version. So again, what you were saying is either very accepting or not at all accepting within the Japanese culture. So it's interesting how that's still an issue in our games. She was
ghost?
one of the ghosts in Paper Mario. She actually joins your party at one point in the game because her sisters were really emotionally abusive, verbally abusive toward her. So she ends up joining your party later on. What was the other character you were thinking of?
Poison from not. I think it's Final Fight.
Hmm.
And from Street Fighter Cross Tekken.
Mhm.
It's the character with the long purple hair and the very feminine figure.
Mm.
She has a police hat and a cut off tank top about right here, showing a lot of midriff, and really short jean shorts.
Who wears short shorts?
No.
No one. It's cold out.
But in the an American release of Final Fight, it was portrayed. Oh yeah, that's a female. That's definitely a female. Not in the Japanese version of the games. In the Japanese versions, it was a transgender male who was still said to have his male orientation. He had everything but the post-op. But that goes along the lines of seeing how much that America censors of the games we get.
Yeah.
Between like Vivian, Birdo, and Poison.
Hmm. I would also say an interesting character, or characters, depending on your point of view, would be Sheik and Zelda. And the controversies between, all of that.
And Samus.
And yeah. Very, very few people were expecting Samus to be a woman when they first played that game. So that's an interesting one as well. But certainly, I think it's interesting now that in Smash, Zelda and Sheik are separate characters rather than a transformation between two presentations, if you would. Whether it be simply because they wanted to flesh out each form with more moves and such, or if they're sending a message. We'll never know. It's Nintendo. They work in mysterious ways.
Well, actually, if you look into some of the lore, originally Sheik was a completely different character, and Zelda was just pretending to be that character.
Things you never knew.
The more you know.
The more you know, the less you know, usually. More questions that pop up. The more you know, the more you're aware of how little you know. But it's certainly an issue. Are you about to abandon us, Carl?
I might be abandoning you.
Dang.
I didn't have to rush home. I would
That's-
still stay.
That's okay. It's a little bit snowing out there. It's not sticking, though.
Let's hope
Um,
I will try and join the second I get home if you guys are still going.
We're probably going to wrap up pretty soon. Everyone's been pretty quiet. But, thanks for stopping in. You guys are always quiet. I'm going to make you talk now because it's just me. Any games you've played recently that covered any of these issues, for better or for worse?
Not off the top of my head that I can think of.
Well, suppose I'll have some closing thoughts and then we'll wrap up then. But I think that there's a lot of ways that we could start to tackle the issue of gender and orientation in games. And I think it is slowly happening the more we have conversations like these. And also, the more that as an industry we start pushing to have more diverse people within our industry, the more we'll have voices to help us make characters of diverse backgrounds. Because that is part of the issue. Is it's difficult to write characters of a background that you don't have background in. Although, I mean, obviously some people, like writers, I mean, that's what they do, is they make characters of many different backgrounds. But even within that, you know, it's hard to write the story of a little girl in a war zone if you've never been a little girl, or in a war zone. There's complications to either of those in a character that if you're not aware of, you're not going to tackle. And so once we start seeing more women in games, you know, more people of color, people of varying orientations, we'll have people who can write characters with those backgrounds and help us tell those stories. So it happens a little bit at a time. But, I mean, you can always talk to those people and have them tell you their story and then put it in game. You don't have to become a little girl in a war zone just to write that story. So, I mean, I think we are seeing change, slowly but surely. And I think that because we're having this conversation, that's one step closer to getting there. A lot of our people are missing tonight, partly because we still, I mean, this is the week right after spring break. Everyone's, you know, realizing they still have to finish all of their projects before the semester ends. So that's what they're doing right now. But thank you guys for coming in, and thank our online viewers for tuning in, being part of the conversation, or at least listening to us live. And as always, these videos do go up onto YouTube afterwards and get shared through various social media. So thank you for being part of the conversation out there in internet land. And again, next week we will, unless I keep losing more of you guys and then it just becomes me talking into a webcam from really far across the room, we'll be discussing race and class as identity in games. So thanks for joining us here and there, and we'll see you next time. And now I run over so I can not have an awkward pause at the end. Here we go. Signing off.